Good morning and welcome. My name is Jitesh Gadhia, and I'm a member of the UK House of Lords. And I think I've been asked to moderate, chair this boardroom discussion this morning. And I have to say, for all of those of you who have been at the plenary session this morning, that was quite an experience and very difficult to beat and almost retune away from and retune into this discussion. But I hope we can do that. And I think our purpose is, I'm not meant to be talking out to you, but we're meant to be talking amongst ourselves and having a boardroom dialogue on a very important topic about what are the skills that people need, that the young people of the need to 2030 and beyond. And as the sort of chair of the discussion, if I can maybe kick off with a few of my thoughts, and I'll get my colleagues around the table to share with you, but just so that you know who everybody is here, going around in clockwise, Reuben Abraham from the IDF Institute, Omar Madhi from Abdul Latif Investments, Saadia from the World Economic Forum, Aki Oyebode from the Lagos State Employment, and Neil Carberry from the CBI. And in a way, thinking about what skills we need for the future presupposes that we actually know what the world of 2030 will actually look like. And therein, I think, lies a part of the challenge. And in many ways, one of the skills of the future will be the skill of reskilling, because that's clear that that is one of the things that we will need, some adaptability and lifelong learning, and the ability for people to disrupt, to future-proof themselves from the forces of disruption. And I think the World Economic Forum had, in some of its recent work, laid out and actually did a survey of what skills do leaders, corporate leaders of today feel that we should possess. And maybe I should, Saadia, turn to you first and ask you to give us some of the findings of that report.
I guess this is the peril of sitting directly in front of the moderator of the session. Let me try to give a quick overview of the research you're referring to. So in our Future of Jobs report a couple of years ago, we didn't try to look at as far out as 2030, because I think at that point the predictions start going into directions that might not be incredibly helpful at the moment. We tried to look out until 2020. And we asked business leaders in 15 economies around the world, across 10 different industry sectors, what they thought the skills of the future would look like. And we really expected that there will be a rise in a lot more technical and digital or STEM-related skills. Instead, what we got back in the aggregate was a much greater premium on very human skills. So a lot more critical thinking, a lot more collaboration, a lot more creativity are the things that people are expecting they will need by 2020. Now, whether that holds true up to 2030 or not remains to be seen, but I think it is important to remember that yes, we're in the midst of the fourth industrial revolution, but that actually might make our human skills more important than they were before.
So from STEM to STEAM, adding sort of the soft skills, the art skills into hard
but also
skills.
just how we relate to each other, how we work together, how we collaborate, can we do teamwork? I think those are some of the factors that are going to become more important, and to be able to use technology in a creative way.
Reuben.
So, okay, so, I used to be a university professor before I took my current job. So let me actually just step back to my old hat for a second and sort of highlight why we care about this so much now as opposed to then. And that's really got to do with the fear that's coming with automation, AI, machine learning, a bunch of these sort of things. And so the question really is as much about jobs as it is about skills, right? And so it's my contention, and I'm just basically putting the risk factor out here, which is that we've always had fears when new technology comes along. So all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, the Luddites, there's always been a fear of technology overtaking jobs and then people being unable to compete, et cetera. And every single time, that fear has turned out to be false. So why is it different this time? I think that's the sort of central risk. And I think it's got to do with the lag effect, and it's got to do with the timing, right? Which is that in each of these cases, there was enough time available to economies to structurally adjust in terms of creating new jobs and training people for these new jobs and so on. I think the problem now is that the speed at which technology is moving means that we may not have the time to adjust. And that has political consequences, especially in a world today where, social media, all of this put together. I think that's the risk. So the question is, can we structurally readjust quickly enough as the jobs of tomorrow actually show up? Or will the political consequences actually undo us? I think that's the risk, and that's what's different this time. And I think I just want to put the risk factor on the table to start with, and then along with the discussion, we can sort of move into the core areas.
Let me just probe a bit further. So one of the things, we talk about the fourth industrial revolution and all the things that sort of, all the contours that define that. And one of the big things is obviously around artificial intelligence, which is fueled by data. And if you drill into that further, algorithms are going to be very important in understanding algorithms.
Yeah.
Do you think that one of the skill sets that the workers of the future need is really a much deeper understanding around the whole world of statistics and bell curves and long tails? Because if you look at the algorithms that are meant to, driverless cars and what will define that, it's not the sort of the top of the bell curve that defines what happens. It's the exceptions. It's what happens that's slightly unpredictable. What do you think of that theory?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so I think again, I think it's foolish to try and predict the future. With that caveat in mind, I suspect that the skills of the future, certainly people who are successful are more than likely going to be people who are comfortable working with data, not just statistical stuff, but just data and complexity. And so, therefore, some element of thinking in systems terms, I think, is going to be super useful because things are going to be vastly interconnected. So therefore, understanding complexity is key. But I think the real key here is that one needs to be comfortable in the world of data. And I think that's increasingly going to become an issue. So, I mean, of the people who work on my team, for instance, so for them, Stata, R, Python, all of these seems to be like speaking English. Whereas for me, I've given up. I'm not even trying, right, to go there. Which is, but it seems like that's where, and again, keep in mind the fact that even now we're talking of the top of the pyramid. I mean, what the bottom requires is probably a completely different set of skills than what we're discussing right now. But if referring to the top, for sure, I think we have to be comfortable with both the world of data and complexity.
Neil, you're from the CBI, which is the Confederation of British Industry, defines itself as the voice of business. What do you say to what Reuben and Saadia have just said?
So I think Reuben's point is a really good one. And we should remember that in the economic dislocations of the past, that didn't mean that there weren't losers in that adaptive change. But if we define where we're going as an existential challenge, there's a risk of it becoming quite downhearted. Actually, if you look at the work that's being done around the world, and some of the best work's been done in Germany around their Industry 4 program, you see that what we're creating now is potentially a world with more jobs and better jobs for our young people than we have now, because we transition into a world where most jobs are jobs of choice, not jobs of process. You know, if the robots are really good at process, let's let them do process. And of course, coming to Reuben's point, we have to understand their world. But what I hear from chief execs in the UK and around Europe is exactly what the West's heard, which is humans becoming valuable for things that humans do well. What do you do where you don't have enough data points to make a judgment about a trend? These kinds of questions, how do you build a consensus around limited data around a boardroom table like this in a corporate in 2030? Interpersonal skills. Oracy is really important in business and will become progressively more important. I think if we think about the setting that we're in today and thinking about our education and skills systems, one of the challenges for schools is probably that literacy and numeracy will remain core gateways into all of this. But businesses will operate increasingly by the principle of floorboards, not keyboards. And that's a critical challenge. So if you go back to a famous ex-British Prime Minister Jim Callaghan gave a speech in Ruskin College in Oxford in the 70s and said, you know, one of the challenges is people who think that education is about creating young people who are fitted for the factories. That is absolutely not where the business community is. And I think the old division in educational debate between preparing people for citizenship and preparing people for work is starting to elide, because the skills people need to be successful in the modern workplace, going to the work that WEF's done to jump the transition, are going to be the same ones as, you know, parliamentarians like yourself want to encourage in good citizens. The critical challenge for me is place, actually. And if you look at the political trends of the last couple of years, we've already seen through the dislocations of the 70s and the 80s and the 90s what happens where parts of countries leap ahead and other parts are left behind. So a big challenge, I think, for most corporates is how do we make sure we don't just look after the places where our offices are? And how do we make sure, you know, in England, our coastal towns, for instance, how do we make sure that we're integrating them in this new economy just as much as we're integrating London or Lagos or any of our major cities?
So talking of Lagos, Aki, what's the perspective from Nigeria?
So I think Neil makes a great point to start off about how it seems job growth is discriminatory today around major hubs of business. So if you take sub-Saharan Africa, for example, where unemployment in some countries is as high as 40%. The quality of jobs is a secondary conversation today. The primary conversation is get some jobs, regardless of how low skilled you are. And so, but on the plus side, I think for Africa and the developing economies, there's also an opportunity through this whole disaggregation to ensure that you jump through some hoops. So if you took 60 years ago, you had to progress from agrarian jobs on the farms through the Industrial Revolution, through a service revolution. Today, I see definitely a few African economies focused on thinking about how do we teach our young people automation, how do we teach critical reasoning, how do we teach emotional intelligence, because those are the skills that are going to be increasingly more important. How you influence people, how you're able to think through different solutions regardless of the industries. So I'd say 20, 30 years ago, there was a lot more focus on specialist skills, very narrow focus specialist skills, whereas today's economy, at least from an African perspective, has to teach a lot more generalist skills. So some of the WEF research I think I found very interesting is you're teaching emotional, human, behavioral attributes. You're teaching people to to think through different solutions regardless of the industries they're in. But when you have 200, 300 million people under the age of 24, like we do in Africa, then these guys don't have to unlearn anything because they've learned very little anyway. So it's an incredible opportunity. I mean, some people might think it's a downside, but because there's very little to unlearn, it's an incredible opportunity. It's a blank sheet to then say, how do we infuse these people with the right skills to ensure that 20, 30 years from now, the continent as a whole is a lot more competitive compared to the developed economies.
So we had the plenary started with this inspirational plea from a colleague of all of us from Sierra Leone, pleading with us not to focus on the jobs but on the education and skills. Do you think, as a relatively neighboring country in Africa, does Nigeria buy into that?
I think you've got to start with the jobs. Because what you run a risk of having relatively well-educated people whose skills are misplaced. So I think you've got to start with the goal in mind. Certainly for us, as a government within Nigeria, as a subnational government, our focus is to understand where's the economy directed at, where the employers, what skills are the employers looking for. So the education conversation is easy to get sucked into, and I slightly disagree with that comment, by the way. I'm sure you figured it out. Because it's easy, it's a social conversation, which ultimately might not solve a problem. So you find that you have some decently educated people, numeracy skills, literate, but there's no work. And so if you think about today's Nigeria, where in some places, people are still learning outdated skills. So you're talking about Python, right? People are learning languages, COBOL, right? So imagine coming out today and saying you want to compete globally, and you say all you've got is COBOL, right? It's a skill, you've been educated. It's just a mismatch for today's economy. So the reality is we must focus from the jobs. Today people are learning virtual reality, artificial intelligence. You can't be teaching people skills that have been obsolete since 1990. So start from the jobs is what I'll say to Sierra Leone, and then you can build backwards to build the right curriculum to deliver jobs at the end of. Because education is not an end in itself; it's a means to an end, and we must always remember that.
Okay, can I add to that?
Yeah.
So, as a regulator, as someone who's performed a regulatory function, you know perfectly well that it's very hard for regulation to keep up with technology. Education is no different, right? Technology moves too fast for curricula to keep up. Right? So the question is, if we take that same old approach to how curriculum is developed and how often we revisit curriculum, so we basically say every 10 years, maybe we need to shift it. You've missed the bus. So we need to also rethink the speed at which we rethink curriculum or decentralize the process in a way that is much more responsive in a very sort of decentralized fashion to local job requirements as opposed to somebody who's performing a centralized function of curriculum development. Because I think technology is going to outpace all of this stuff.
That decentralization is really important and it's starting to happen in lots of countries. But I think alongside that decentralization, and I suppose I speak for 190,000 members of businesses in the UK, so I'll be a bit challenging to my own backyard here. Some of this is about acknowledging that there's a certain amount of technical education that we can expect the state system to support and develop. And in an environment where people are retraining regularly through their career, you cannot expect state education to deliver the workplace skills strategy of individual corporates. So corporates have to get over themselves a little bit. The state will always do something slightly generalizable. There does need to be a major investment by corporates in their own survivability. We've heard that phrase about people are our greatest asset. I think increasingly there's pressure to make sure that that's how companies behave.
So absolutely, that you don't have the finished article coming from education into work. Omar, we haven't heard from you yet. Saudi Arabia is going through a period of great change. What are your perspectives?
So I view myself as having to deliver a regional perspective rather than just Saudi Arabia. And I think unlike other regions, the pace of change here seems to be, although we've been a bit slower in the past, the pace now is really moving at tremendous speeds. And I think globally, of course, the issue is a war for talent. And it's literally a war because ultimately, any business in the world will tell you it's about two things. It's about the product or the strategy, and it's about the people delivering that. So the human factor is really what distinguishes successful versus failed companies. And the Middle East is no different from that perspective. Given that we are in the UAE, I think we also need to speak about what the UAE on a federal level, a national level, has been doing. Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid really stated his vision by saying that a failure to really address the aspirations of the youth is like swimming against the tide. And because the youth represent the majority of our populations in the Middle East, really preparing them for the workforce is extremely important. And although the topic of jobs versus education is something that I really don't want to dwell on, but we look at it, I think, as employability versus employment. And the employability side comes from the educational side rather than from the business side. But the education side needs to understand what business needs and what business wants. So typically what governments in this part of the world struggle with is how do we deliver what we need to deliver? So they understand what needs to be done, but as you all mentioned, the speed of change on education and on skills and on the needs of the workforce are moving at such a fast pace that it sometimes is difficult to deliver the right types of programs that address these needs at scale and within the necessary time. So I think doing that is extremely important. The UAE has established, of course, its national agenda on that. They've recently also established the Council for Education and Human Resources, which brings together the critical government entities to work on the how do we deliver what we need to deliver on the educational side. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, as well, has launched some visionary aspirations and plans, including the Vision 2030 program, the National Transformation Program as well, which is a bit more short-term in nature till 2020. And all of the programs are really based on the foundation of delivering them in the right time and within the right cost, and that's also dependent on the human factor. So Saudi as a country, we have something which we feel is a blessing, but also can be a significant challenge in the future, which is we have a very young population. About 70% of our people are below the age of 40. All of these people, like any other human being, want to be educated, want to have access to good education, want to have access to healthcare, want to be able to be employed, and to form a family. So the platform there is really education and transforming the educational system from at all levels, starting at kindergarten and pre-kindergarten, actually all the way to 12th grade, and then beyond that to higher education is a significant challenge for us. And the significant part of the challenge lies in the fact that it's scale. We have 20 million inhabitants in the country that are nationals, unlike most other GCC countries where the nationals form a minority. So that scale poses a huge problem for us. Creating the necessary skill for these people to be employable and to have what's needed in the next generation job, fourth industrial revolution type of job, is extremely important. And there I think there have been significant studies done on what percentage or what probability there is for different types of jobs to be automated in the future. So I think we need to take the lowest probability jobs for automation then and really focus on the skills that are needed to fill those jobs. So what are the differentiating factors of humans versus machines that we can build on? I think critical thinking is probably the most important element there, because no matter what, a machine cannot have empathy, it cannot have sympathy. So human beings, if you combine empathy and sympathy with the critical thinking element, and you find the jobs that need that in the future, then I think you're solving for a big chunk of the equation.
That's great. You talked about scale and 20 million. Reuben, India,
Scale.
1.3 billion and growing. Will probably, in this time frame that we're talking about, overtake China as the most populous country in the world. How on earth does India just grapple with its scale issue?
So it's fascinating because as Omar was speaking, I was thinking of something, and I'm glad you asked me, which is this, again, and I go back to decentralization. Because if you look at India, you've missed the point. Because, for instance, the rhetoric around India is that India is a very young country, right? The youngest population in the world, average age 25, 26. Now the problem is, now let's break down India by states, right? And keep in mind that Uttar Pradesh is bigger than Brazil, right? The average Indian state is bigger than Germany. Now, so when you break it up like that, what you'll find is the state of Tamil Nadu, which has a population of about 90 million or 80 million, something in that range. Average age is 31. And then you take a state like Bihar, which again has a population of about 100 million, has an average age of 19, right? That's the divergence, demographic divergence internally. So again, if you come up with a one-size-fits-all policy, you're not going to be able to accommodate for this sort of divergence. And my guess is that every large country in the world, you're going to find the same problem. So the more you decentralize and you federate, the better the chances that you'll actually come up with a solution that works locally. Which is why, I mean, by the way, this is something that I equally holds true if you look at India as an investment destination. India as an investment destination tells you nothing. You should think about states.
So this decentralization is coming up time and again, and I read a very interesting report about the Finnish education system, which is in some respects held as a sort of a gold standard, and it comes very high in some of the PISA rankings. And one of the features of that is that teachers need to be trusted to actually deliver this on the ground. In a way, they're the ones who need to be the right judge of that. I mean, you talked about decentralization. What do you think of that theory?
So I think we can learn from lots of jurisdictions around the world, but we also always need to approach that in a kind of culturally aware place. I mean, it doesn't compare to India, but it's very difficult to compare schools in England to schools in Finland. Finland is largely a monoculture. England is not a monoculture. So there are a number of different challenges in different places. What I'd say, we use a phrase now at the CBI when we talk about skills, but I think it applies to schools as well, which is you need national stability for local leadership. So at the national level, you need to give people a framework, and if you're a corporate thinking about skills, you don't want to have a lack of comparability between someone who does an apprenticeship in London versus someone who does an apprenticeship in Newcastle. But what you do want is that apprenticeship to be in something that is relevant to the economies in those two places. So it is absolutely about decentralization, but it's also about how you build the system for that decentralization. And if there's one thing that we push ministers for, and I know colleagues in other business organizations around the world do, it's stop just pulling the lever, stop just designing the system. Start thinking about what's the frame that I'm giving the professionals to drive this change and to do the decentralization. And that's a big challenge because democratic accountability in our public skills systems and school systems is very important. And it's a bit messy, but it has the potential to be more fitted for the future we're heading for.
I just want to sort of take a bit of time out here, and maybe what I've heard around the table from all of your sources sort of matches 7 almost survival skills for for everybody for the future, which I had noted down. And I just want to quickly summarize them, but then just probe into some of them, because some of them are more difficult than others. So we've heard repeatedly critical thinking and problem solving. That's number 1. Number 2, collaboration across networks and the ability to lead by influencing. That's another key skill. Agility and adaptability. Number 3. Number 4, initiative and entrepreneurialism. 5, being good at oral and written communication, the basics. 6, accessing and analyzing information and data. And the 7th, which I think is, to me, a little bit like the curate's egg, curiosity and imagination, which at the end of the day is, if you like, could be the X factor in innovation. Just want to dwell on that one. How do you teach that?
Well, there are a number of, I'm going to take a shot at this. There is the change that's required inside our school systems. I think it goes back to what you were talking about. The ability to continue to learn across your lifetime is something that has to be instilled very early. A lot of what you've laid out, those 7 factors, those are things that have to be instilled very early. And that is true, and we should aim for that. At the same time, there are 3 billion people already in the world's workforce who are not going to go back to those fundamental education systems. So we can't ignore that part of the problem. They are the parents of that future generation. So we're not going to move forward and get to any of these changes unless we make that investment in that current adult workforce. And the narrative there tends to get stuck in sort of 2 poles. One is the robot apocalypse, and the other one is the sort of the basic income silver bullet. And we need not end in either. And in fact, in the second one, I'm not sure we want to end up there, because people have meaning and identity in what they do. And the sort of the sit back and basic income approach is maybe not the way to go. So then if you come back to that reskilling challenge, I think there are 2 aspects we should think about. One is that we've been talking about technology as the thing that's driving some of these changes due to which we need reskilling. But we can actually use some of that technology to provide that reskilling. And yes, of course, there's that, the possibility of ed tech and what can be done there. But I'm talking about something a little bit more fundamental. If we're going to do any kind of strategic workforce planning, if we're going to do that decentralization in a systematic way, then we do need to use big data to understand what is actually happening in terms of skills. Look at bundles of skills across existing roles and understand how you make that shift. So part of the work we did this year at Davos is a study on Towards a Reskilling Revolution that's basically trying to look at the entire US labor market using big data to understand what are the current bundles of skills across all 1,000 or so job types in the labor market, and then compare them to where we might want to get to by 2026. Now, this is just one study, but what we found is it's going to take, on average, if we want to get about 95% of the people through this transition, it's going to take, on average, 2 years of retraining. That is a massive investment in terms of just the actual financial resources required, but also the time investment and the opportunity cost those people are going to face during that time. So all of that is going to require that kind of strategic thinking, using big data to understand what skills we need, and then planning it out so that you're giving people that space to do that locally. But it does require some central approach to it. And then the second piece is, and you've heard from folks based in Omar Akin. Things look quite different in other parts of the world, right? And we tend to think of platforms and the gig economy as this great disruptor in the Western world, and it may very well be. But in the last 10 years alone, there has been a 50% increase in women working across the Muslim world, and a lot of that is because they've used these new technologies in a wholly unprecedented way. Their governments made some of that investment in terms of education, and now they're using that technology in a completely entrepreneurial, unprecedented fashion. So again, I think we need to see technology as one of the ways in which we can do that redistribution that we're all looking for, and not only as the thing that's causing the disruption.
Omar.
So I have this issue where WhatsApp causes me anxiety. But I can't get rid of it because I'm always wondering what next video is going to come that would have really been useful to me, which I'm going to miss if I don't have WhatsApp and if I'm not engaged in that group that I'm supposed to be engaged in. And this is actually a prime example because yesterday I got a video. This gentleman, a professor, was talking about inquisitiveness and entrepreneurship and artistic thinking. And he said, we don't need to train that. It's in basic human nature. And he says parents are the biggest issue there because they actually don't allow their children to do that. So he gave a very interesting example. I have 3 children. One of them is 1 year old. And she likes to take eggs and play with eggs, and that's like a disaster in the kitchen. And he actually gave the egg example because he said, when children take eggs, you should actually let them play with them, see what they're like, let them drop them, and then it turns from a physics lesson to a biology lesson. You talk to them about gravity, it breaks, and then you have this life form that could have formed inside. So if we as parents keep that in mind, I think from the inquisitive point of view, that's an interesting perspective, that just let your children be children. And I think that goes back also to the Finnish model. Because the Finnish education model, one of the things that I recall seeing was it's to a very large extent based on just letting children play outside and not be in a classroom. But then, also thinking about what to do to address all of these issues. I come from a bit of a different school of thought, whereby I believe it's the role of the private sector actually to take the lead. We cannot be dependent on governments to solve our problems. The government should actually be in the navigator seat. Private sector has to be, and the business people and the entrepreneurs have to be in the driver's seat. Government basically has to provide basic infrastructure to allow things to happen. Everything else should be driven by the private sector. At Abdel Latif Jameel, and I need to plug this because it's extremely important, we've really taken this motto and this philosophy to a next level. So our chairman is an alum of MIT, and because he feels MIT is really doing its thing towards bettering the world. So he has endowed 3 laboratories at MIT, which we all call the J Labs. So there's the Jameel Poverty Action Lab, which addresses a lot of topics along the poverty silo. Then we have the Jameel World Water and Food Security Lab. And then from the importance of the education side, and especially what we see, given that we operate in 30 countries around the world, the human element is extremely important. So we established recently the Jameel World Education Lab. And there we're trying to really create a renaissance in education, both in this part of the world, but across the world. And this is the one that we're most passionate about, because the first thing we did once we established it is we linked the lab to the Saudi government and specifically to the Ministry of Education. And we told them, talk to each other, get access to MIT and to its resources and to the resources at Harvard and other places. So the point I'm just trying to make is that we need to take our own responsibility for our destiny, and we cannot be dependent on the government to do that for us. And we really need to contribute to preparing that next workforce of the future. Because if we're going to depend on what the government is going to provide to us, it's going to be probably a very long day and a very long week and year and century. So,
well, as someone who's come into Parliament from the private sector, I have a lot of sympathy with that. And you mentioned almost that we sort of teach to the test rather than teach for experiences.
Yeah.
And Aki, maybe you get your reflections.
I think there's and to your question around teaching people on how to be inquisitive, I think we've got to resolve a philosophical challenge. So is education about signaling or skill building? Now you find that a lot of the time, education is about signaling, right? And because it's generally a tool towards signaling, then people learn what they feel you'll be impressed by. And that happens with parents, that happens with students, and that happens with even how the curriculum is developed. The second part is education is incredibly difficult to disrupt. And if you take the top 50 or 100 universities as an example, take Harvard, for example. Harvard 100 years ago is fairly different from Harvard today. They might not like to hear that, but that's the truth. And it still all boils down to the fact that if you get a Harvard Business School degree, then you're more likely to get into JP or Goldman. So the point is, it's not because you believe the education is the best for you, it's because you think the employer is going to hire you because you have a certain skill. No. So I think, solving the problems about creativity, being inquisitive, starts with unpacking that mantra that we've got to move people from thinking education is primarily a tool of signaling to a tool of skill building. Because if it's a skill building focused objective, then you recognize that people will learn as much as they need to learn. Then the second part is access to learning tools. So again, I speak here from sub-Saharan Africa, right? And I think to the point around India, Nigeria is incredibly different, right? So Lagos is 20 million people, right? Access to internet, superb. So internet penetration in Lagos is about 80-90%. There's nowhere across Lagos that's not covered. But as you go towards the north of the country, then coverage drops to 5%. So how are these people going to learn? They can be inquisitive for as much as you want, but the learning tools will never get to them. I mean, there's a video I saw to Omar's point around WhatsApp, why WhatsApp is very funny and very useful. There's a Ghanaian guy who's teaching computer education on a chalkboard, right? The guy is literally like, I mean, I don't know how long it took him to draw that diagram. I can't even draw that diagram if I was paid, right? But that's the point, that there are people who are learning computer education from a chalkboard. Now, regardless of how inquisitive they are, there's only a limit to how much they can learn. So also access to broadband in developing economies is a critical tool. You can't do this without the infrastructure. So the point is African governments must invest, and developing governments must first invest in the infrastructure that delivers these skills to these people before we start solving the problems around being inquisitive. But yes.
Reuben, yes?
So I think Akin makes a really good set of points. So on the signaling piece, so could not agree more. Now the problem is when you pick up an education because you think it signals, and then the signaling fails, right? Then what happens? So let me give you an example from the Indian context. So today, if you were to work for a cab company, any sort of average cab company, versus say you get a bachelor's degree from a no-name college, say in commerce, as a cab driver, you will earn at least 5 to 6 times more than what you'd earn with a bachelor's degree from a no-name college. And yet, people flock to the no-name college to get that bachelor's degree instead of actually going and learning a different skill that could actually better your life. And so it's very difficult to unpack that, as in we don't really know what's playing out there. I mean, is it cultural? We don't know what's playing out. But the signaling factor, I'm getting this education because I think it's signaling, except it's not signaling, or the jobs don't exist, right? I mean, there is that problem. So that's one. And then second, just on a macro issue, which, because it never actually creeps into these kind of discussions, but I think it's actually critical, which is he sort of raised it, which is the distributional consequences, right? I mean, what does macro distribution look like? So for people in the room who are not aware of this, so there's work done by people like Richard Florida, et cetera, which clearly show that about 70% of global GDP comes from about 40 urban regions globally. And these are, so the biggest of which is the eastern seaboard of the United States, Silicon Valley, the eastern seaboard of China, the Pearl River Delta, so that's really where, so if you say 70% of jobs are being created, GDP is being created there, it's a fair assumption to make that the jobs will also get created there. However, the population is not distributed in the same fashion.
Yeah.
Right? What are the consequences of that? Right? Yes, the world is urbanizing very, very quickly. But there is still this mismatch between where the jobs are to where the people are, right? Now, the whole thing was when the internet first took off in the 90s, I mean, there was in fact even a book written called The Death of Distance, which basically said, bringing in these new technologies will actually enable, sort of your ability to actually work without actually being co-located in a city, but actually the data shows greater concentration into urban centers. How do we get around that problem?
So you're creating super clusters.
Yeah, we're creating really massive super clusters. I mean, London's another example.
I just want to build on this because I think this is a fantastic point Akin's made about signalling versus skill, and it has lots of roots off it. One of them is absolutely this idea of place and clusters and areas that get left behind while others move ahead. And of course, as we move into the world of AI, if you're a year behind an AI, you're a multiple number of years behind an AI as the technology advances. A couple of things along with place that I think are also important. One is we certainly observe in European societies, in some communities, the death of the belief that education and income outcomes are linked. We see it, and we see some of that in parts of England, for instance. And that has to be driven by the framing that young people have in their lives. Their parents, there's a standard joke that parental careers advice is always 30 years out of date. So there's work for us all to do to make the pathways clearer for young people as they work through. But the other thing is, and we haven't touched on it yet, so I thought I'd throw it on the table now, disruption will fall unevenly across the labour market, and it will disrupt in ways which we are not used to. We have businesses that we work with at the CBI who are using AI for document review. They are lawyers.
Yep.
The people who do document review in legal firms are potential future partners of that firm. You signal by doing 12, 14 hours a day of really, frankly, apologies to the lawyers in the room, boring stuff to show that you're going to put the effort in and you're capable of being a partner. Those jobs are going to gradually cease to exist. And what we will be faced with is a firm, Magic Circle law firm is thinking, where's our supply chain gone of future partners? At the other end, we chronically underpay social care workers, yet we need millions of them globally. And frankly, those human skills are hugely difficult to get right. So the engineering of our labour market will change in ways that I don't think publicly we've been willing to acknowledge yet.
So I think we've had a very rich seam of discussion around the sort of mismatch, if you like, or the technology-induced mismatch in skills, but also the people mismatch. You've got median age in India of 27, but in Africa of 19. And yet it's, we have a rapidly aging population in Europe. I know that this is focused around skills, but you can't take people out of that equation. Do you, Neil, and this is not just targeted at the UK and as it grapples with the complexity of Brexit, but how do we think about the movement of people in that context? And actually, if you have a mismatch of skills and you need them from one part of the world into another, how do you manage that effectively?
Well, there's sort of three things I'd say. One is there actually potential for distance to die? So can we do fly in, fly out, or over broadband more effectively? Can your lawyer be in Lagos and advising a client in London? I think those things are potentially possible. Secondly, I think mobility matters. It helps close skills gaps, of course it does, but it's never going to be a replacement for investment in the domestic skills base. So I think we shouldn't view immigration or mobility as a systemic and structural solution to this, even if it is a solution for individuals and for certain skills shortages. The thing that occupies my mind, and I think it's where governments are playing catch-up, frankly, is the nature of the global economy. Because if I am a British company and I want to sell product into consumers in Brazil, I am not going to hire someone from Bromsgrove. I'm going to hire someone from Brazil, and I'm going to bring them to the UK to learn about the product before I send them back. And that close coupling of the international economy and the path of globalization is perhaps less clear now than it was 3 or 4 years ago. But that form of mobility, I think, is absolutely essential to all of our global growth. And for young people coming into the labour market, that sense of global citizenship, awareness of the place in the world, I think will be really important. It's very obvious, for instance, that Jaguar Land Rover, one of Britain's marquee auto manufacturers, says to managers from the West Midlands in England that the best way to get ahead in their career is to spend some time in China.
So our time is almost up. We have less than 2 minutes. So we talked about globalization. WEF regards itself as maybe the custodian of globalization. So Saadia, I will give you, as the only female member on our board, the last word.
I think there have been some excellent points. I think the signaling piece is extremely important. Education as a poor signal for what we're really trying to look for, which is skill sets, that is something we have to get past. And just reiterating my earlier point, I think we can use technology as part of the solution to the signaling problem, part of the solution to the massive reskilling challenge, and part of the solution to the geography of jobs challenge, but it's only a start in that one.
Great discussion. Thank you, everyone.